It is 4:30 in the morning, and the City of London is still drowned in darkness. Not the soft, manageable darkness of a bedroom with curtains drawn, but the deep, coal-black darkness of a world that has not yet remembered itself. Outside, the streets are slicked with November fog, that famous Victorian murk that smells of river water and burning coal and the accumulated exhaustion of 10,000 chimneys breathing all at once. The gas lamps on the thoroughfare glow with a ghostly, jaundiced yellow, illuminating almost nothing, casting long shadows that seem to move of their own accord. Somewhere in the distance, a horse clatters over cobblestones. A dog barks once, sharply, then stops. Inside the grand townhouse on Belgrave Square, 5 stories of white stuccoed Regency architecture, with iron railings and window boxes and the general air of a building that has never once doubted its own importance, the family sleeps. Lord and Lady Ashworth and their 3 children lie in their respective beds beneath thick eiderdown quilts and embroidered linen sheets. The nursery fire has been kept banked through the night by a separate arrangement. No one upstairs will wake before 8 o'clock. No one upstairs will need to. But in the basement, behind a door that opens onto a narrow set of stone steps leading down from the servants' entrance in the area below street level, something stirs. Her name is Mary. She is 14 years old. Before we follow Mary into this morning, I want to take just a moment to speak to you directly. If you're watching this channel for the first time, welcome. The stories we tell here are about real history. The kind that doesn't always make it into textbooks. The kind told from the ground up rather than from the top down. If these narratives matter to you, if you believe that ordinary lives deserve to be remembered with the same care as the lives of kings and generals, then please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Every subscriber genuinely helps this community grow and keeps these stories alive. Now, let's go back to Mary. Let's go back to that cold stone floor. Mary has been awake since 4:15. She knows this not because she possesses a watch. She does not and could not afford one. But because the scullery maid in the bed beside her, a girl named Agnes, has an almost supernatural ability to rouse herself at the same time every morning. And Agnes stirred at 4:15, which woke Mary, and now both girls are sitting on the edge of their shared iron bedstead in a room that is approximately 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, pulling on their stockings in the near total dark. The room they share is in the basement of the house, beneath street level, and is separated from the coal cellar by a single thin wall. The window, which faces the area, the narrow below-ground courtyard between the house and the street, admits no direct sunlight at any hour of the day, in any season of the year. In summer, the room is stuffy and airless. In winter, which it now is, the cold comes in through the window frame and settles on the floor like a second occupant. There is no fireplace in this room. There is no heating of any kind. The girls sleep in their underclothes and keep their uniform dresses hanging on hooks behind the door. And every morning, the first act of their waking life is to dress themselves by feel, by habit, with the numb efficiency of people who have learned that warmth is something you must generate from motion rather than wait for from the world. Mary is a housemaid. More specifically, she is the under-housemaid, the lowest rank of housemaid in a household that employs, in total, 11 servants. Above her in the hierarchy stand the head housemaid, a woman of 32 named Mrs. Well, called Mrs., though she has never been married, the honorific being a courtesy title granted to senior female servants, Mrs. Pierce. Above Mrs. Pierce stands the housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a severe woman of 50 who controls every aspect of the domestic operation of the house with the precision and absolute authority of a general managing a campaign. Above Mrs. Davison, technically, stands the butler, Mr. Hargreaves, who is responsible for the male servants and the front-of-house operations, who has authority over the footman and the coachman and the hall boy, and who regards Mrs. Davison with a wariness that is mutual and professionally unspoken. Mary has been in service since she was 13. She came from a village in Dorset, the second of 6 children of a farm labourer and his wife, and when the opportunity arose, through a connection of a connection, the way these things always worked. To enter service in a London household, her mother had wept with a relief that Mary had not fully understood at the time, but understood now, completely, as the kind of relief that comes when a problem has been solved. Mary was a problem that had been solved. There were still 5 children at home. The wages Mary sent back, £4 10 shillings per year paid quarterly, made a difference that was not abstract. She does not resent this. It is simply the architecture of her life. By 4:45, Mary is dressed and moving through the basement corridor toward the back stairs. She carries a small tin box containing her cleaning materials: black lead paste, brushes, cloths, a small hand brush for the hearth, and a wooden bucket for the ash. The corridor is lit by a single oil lamp kept burning on a shelf near the housekeeper's room, and its light barely reaches the far end. Mary knows this corridor the way she knows her own hands. She has walked it every morning for 11 months. Her first task, and it is a task that defines the Victorian housemaid more than any other single thing, is the fires. Every fireplace in the house must be cleaned, laid, and lit before any member of the family descends. This is the immovable commandment of the household. The family must never encounter cold grates. The family must never see ash. The family must never become conscious of the mechanism by which their comfort is produced. This invisibility of labour is not incidental but essential, not a side effect of the arrangement but its entire philosophical foundation. The house must appear to run itself. The warmth must seem to arrive of its own accord. The clean surfaces must seem never to have been dirty. To achieve this illusion, someone must begin at 4:45 in the morning. Mary starts in the dining room, which is on the ground floor at the back of the house, and which will be needed earliest. Breakfast is served at 9, which means the room must be warm by 8:30 at the latest, which means the fire must be lit well before that, which means the grate must be cleaned and laid first. She sets down her box and bucket as quietly as she can, though the family is 3 floors above her and the walls of these houses are thick, and she kneels before the fireplace on the bare wooden floor. The grate is cold. The ash from the previous evening's fire lies in a grey heap beneath the iron bars, mixed with clinker, the hardened, partially fused residue that forms when coal burns at high temperature and must be broken apart with the hearth poker before it can be removed. Mary has done this several thousand times. She does it now, reaches in with gloved hands, works the clinker loose, scoops the ash carefully. Carefully, always carefully, because ash raised too vigorously fills the air and settles on every surface in the room and means the entire room must be dusted again, which is time that does not exist, and transfers it all to the wooden bucket. Then the black lead. The Victorian fireplace was a thing of elaborate cast iron. Grates and surrounds and hob grates decorated with intricate scrollwork and classical motifs, and all of it requiring regular treatment with black lead paste to prevent rust and maintain the glossy, almost mirror-like black finish that was considered the proper appearance of a well-kept grate. Mary applies the paste with one brush, works it in, and polishes it off with another. And when she is done, the grate gleams even in the low light of the single candle she has brought with her. Gleams as if it had been installed this morning, as if it had never contained a fire at all. Now she lays the new fire. Paper, twisted into neat cylinders. Kindling, arranged in a precise crosshatch. Coal, placed with deliberate care so that it will catch from the kindling and build steadily rather than smothering the flame. She lights it, watches for a moment to confirm it has taken, and moves on. There are 8 fireplaces in the main house. The servants' hall has its own range. The kitchen has its own range, which is the cook's domain, and not Mary's responsibility. But the kitchen fire must be lit early enough for Mrs. Beatty the cook to begin preparations by 6. Mary also does not light that fire. It is Agnes, the scullery maid, whose job it is to be in the kitchen by 5 o'clock and have the range going. But the 8 fireplaces of the main house are Mary's responsibility, and she will move through them systematically, from the ground floor upward, spending approximately 20 minutes on each grate, for a total of roughly 2.5 hours of fire laying before she has even begun the rest of her day.